Sony released their updated, highly regarded ZV-E10 II camera this summer, I eagerly looked forward to watching the YouTube reviews to see what the footage looked like. The first version of this camera was amazingly popular, and Sony has a great reputation for making amazing sensors and cameras that take very cinematic, beautiful footage. The updated ZV-E10 II even has the same sensor as in Sony's much more expensive FX30 video camera, so I was really expecting to see some jaw-dropping footage. However, in almost every review I saw, the footage looked kind of terrible, more like something you'd see from an iPhone camera. Most of these reviewers' footage had one of three telltale signs of non-cinematic footage. First, blown out skies, where a blue sky would look white and flat, or if there were clouds you wouldn't be able to see the details in them. Second, little to no background blur. So instead, when you have a subject that's close to the camera and seeing the background blur nicely behind it, you just get everything in focus. And third, this one's a little bit harder to pinpoint, but just something about the motion in the footage, either when the camera panned or when something moved, looked kind of jerky and digital and overly sharpened. I instantly recognized that all of these problems are things that can be fixed with a simple $25 add-on that works not just with the ZV-E10 II, but with any interchangeable lens camera. That's this, the humble ND filter. You see, the reason your camera is getting blown out highlights, or not enough background blur, or overly sharp, jittery looking motion, all comes down to the same problem: too much light on the sensor. These camera sensors are designed to be very sensitive to light so that they work great in low light conditions, but this can be a problem when you take them outside and point it at a bright sky, for example. An ND filter helps solve this problem essentially by just darkening the image. It's like sunglasses for your camera. You put it on the front of your lens and it makes everything dimmer. ND stands for neutral density, meaning that these filters affect all wavelengths of light equally. So unlike other filters where they might adjust the color, neutral density filters simply reduce the total amount of light in all wavelengths equally. ND filters come in all different sizes for different lens types and also different price ranges depending on quality. This one here is a variable ND filter. So if I turn the rings, it's got two rings, and I turn them relative to each other, it adjusts the amount of light that lets through. Here's as clear as it gets, and here's as opaque as it gets. Clear as it gets, as opaque as it gets. I won't go into the physics of how this variable ND filter works, but it's basically like magic. You just turn these two outer rings relative to each other, and it adjusts the amount of light that gets through. You can also buy ND filters with fixed amount of darkening, and these tend to have higher quality results, but then you have to get a filter for each different level of lightness that you might want to adjust by. So why can't your camera just essentially turn down the volume on the sensor rather than putting sunglasses on the front of the lens? Well, it can, but it can only do it to some degree before it starts really losing image quality. Your camera has two other major levers that it can pull to adjust the brightness, but each of these, if used improperly, can affect the cinematic look of your footage in different ways. The first method is simply adjusting the aperture on your camera. That's literally just the hole that is between the lens and the sensor, and you can set the f-stop higher, which makes it smaller, that lets less light through, and you can set it lower, which makes it bigger and lets more light through. However, when you've set it smaller at the higher aperture numbers, then you get much less background blur. The other option is to adjust your shutter speed, which just simply reduces or increases the amount of time that your sensor is exposed for each frame of your video. So if it's exposed for, say, 1/3000th of a second, that's letting in a lot less light than if it's exposed for like 1/48th of a second. However, if you're exposing it for such a short period of time on each frame, then each individual image is going to look very sharp, which is great for a still image, but when you see it in motion, it ends up looking jittery, digital, and overly sharp. This is where motion blur comes in. So the rule of thumb for cinematic footage is that the shutter speed should be set to 1/2 of the frame rate. So if the frame rate is 24 frames per second, then the shutter speed should be 1/48th of a second. And if your frame rate is set to 30 frames per second, which is much more compatible than 24 frames per second for a lot of social media sites and whatnot, then you should set your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. Having the sensor exposed like that for a longer time during each frame makes the individual images, a little bit blurrier, but that ends up looking nice in motion, and it helps each image relate more to each other, so that instead of looking like that, it'll look smooth. So where does this leave us? If I want to have cinematic footage, I want to have my aperture as wide open as possible so I get a nice blurry background. And I also want to have my shutter speed set to a fairly low number, like 1/60th of a second if I'm shooting a 30 frames per second video. But then I go to point my camera at the sky, and it's just letting in way too much light. So the sky ends up getting blown out and just looks white. But if I put my ND filter on the front of the lens, then I can have my cake and eat it too. I can have my nice blurry backgrounds, I can have my motion blur, and I can not blow out the highlights in my images. I've developed a nearly foolproof method for using this variable ND filter to let my camera always shoot cinematic footage while also being able to have some auto settings that let it adjust when I move from, say, a bright sky to the shadows under some trees. 1. Set my aperture to a nice low value. On my ZV-E10 II kit lens, the lowest it will go is f3.5, which still gives me nice background blur when shooting close objects. 2. Set my shutter speed to half my frame rate, which is usually 30 frames per second and 1/60th of a second shutter speed for web videos, and 24 frames per second with 1/48th of a second shutter speed for film projects. 3. Set my ISO to auto, so it will turn up or down the sensor sensitivity depending on how brightly lit wherever I'm pointing the camera is. 4. Make sure I have zebra stripes turned on my camera's display so I can see when parts of the image are overexposed and will be recorded as blown out pure white pixels. 5. With the ND filter attached and these settings active, point my camera at the brightest spot I'll be filming and then adjust the ND filter just to the point where there are no zebra stripes, so I know I'll be able to record there without blowing out the highlights.